Hey, folks, Zach Osterman here. I'm inside our Indianapolis Star. He is Mike Neislick. I'm Zach Osterman. This is, I guess, something of an emergency, mind your banners. Indiana has a new basketball coach, Darian DeVries, most recently of West Virginia. I think perhaps more notably of Drake, where he spent 6 years before taking the West Virginia job last year, is Indiana's new head coach, 31st coach in program history. Going to cost Indiana, I think, a little north of $6 million to buy him out of his contract at West Virginia, which is certainly a record for this place. If it isn't a record overall for men's college basketball, it approaches it. I think it is fair. We will get to some comments, I promise, but I want to get your thoughts first. I think it is fair to say this is not a hire that comes without drawbacks. I mean, I don't think it's unfair to point out there are some questions that can only be answered with time with this hire. And listen, that's true of every hire a little bit. And I've seen hires declared home runs that, just absolutely never materialized into them. But I understand anybody who's got some questions tonight. It's a matter of kind of how you want to see DeVries' resume.
Yeah, I mean, I think that what's interesting, we talked off the air about how 10 years ago Dana Altman might have made a good sense here. And they hired a guy that got to start with Altman and has had sort of consistent success like Altman early in his career in terms of what he's been able to do at Drake. I think he's young for the amount of experience he has, like in coaching. I feel like, 2+ decades, longtime assistant at Creighton, kind of cut his teeth there. And then just sort of had immediate success wherever he's gone. The turnaround at West Virginia was record 1 year record turnaround in terms of number of wins, 10 wins. Obviously everybody thought they should have made the tournament, and that was kind of why they were in the spotlight the last couple of days. I think his success is notable. I think his experience is notable. I mean, would you have wanted, in an ideal world, maybe more Division I experience or Power 4 experience? Sure, but I mean,
I think you mean Power. I mean, he's never not coached in Division I.
Power 4. Sorry,
Power 4. Yeah,
Power 4 experience. But at the same time, I think that the last 7 years, there's no question that he's earned a spot and sort of being in discussion for these larger openings.
I think the first thing, let's. In the interest of balance, I think we can talk about both things. I think the selling point to me, you bring up number one, is experience. He comes from a couple of pretty successful coaching trees, especially Greg McDermott. McDermott is, like, if you look at his, DeVries is probably one of the sturdiest branches, but DJ Otzelberger, Ben Jacobson, like some really good, head coaches have kind of touched Greg McDermott's career. As a head coach, he's won wherever he's been. And he took Drake from 17 wins to 24 wins in his first season. If you kind of want to put that in some wider context, Drake won 7 games in 2017, won 17 under Nico Medved in 2018. Medved was only there for a year before going to Colorado State. And then DeVries took over and never won fewer than 20 games in a season. He won 24 or more in 5 of the 6 seasons. He made it to 3 NCAA tournaments. I think in part because of Darian DeVries, there's a bit of a perception that that Drake is a sort of can't miss mid-major job, not unlike maybe a Dayton, for example. But it's really not. I mean, if you look at Drake, kind of had a run in the late 60s, early 70s where they went to 3 straight NCAA tournaments, and I think made a Final Four, and this was obviously a different time in college basketball. Between 1971 and DeVries' hiring in 2018, Drake went to the NCAA tournament 1 time. So you're talking about a guy who in the last 50 years owns 3 of Drake's 5 NCAA tournaments, if we include this season.
Well, I think the win they had in the first 4 was their first win in the NCAA tournament since 1971.
Yes, that was they went to a regional final in 71 under Morty John. But I mean, there's a lot of, just to be honest, like a lot of real sort of ugliness here. And then there's kind of this one brief burst of light where Keno Davis wins 28 games and goes to the goes to the NCAA tournament. DeVries actually matched what I believe 28 was a record until Ben McCollum broke it this year when he got to 30. And even the West Virginia job, I mean, like I know people aren't necessarily going to be over the moon with what he did at West Virginia, but number one, this was a job.
Can I interject here? Because I think this is kind of instructive. And this is where I think it's interesting to me why maybe he's a better hire than if you look at his resume, it's small. But what he did at West Virginia, rebooting that roster without
that's what I was about to say.
Like but without his son was the only transfer they took from Drake. So this wasn't a Cignetti situation where you're taking a core of a good team and you're just replacing it and you're putting it at West Virginia. He went out, he got, I think it was 8 transfers, won a big recruiting battle for Joanne Small, and compiled a roster of guys like from all over the place. I think a couple guys from Illinois. So that was sort of interesting to me, the idea that his success wasn't just built on what he did at Drake. This was sort of a whole new roster, right? Like, I mean, not just a whole new roster, but a whole new roster to him that he built and he made them and he turned them around, that 10-game wins, I think 4 over the top 20 in the net rankings. And so that's sort of what kind of not just the success, but the way he had that success without sort of just relying on Drake's 5 best players and that's who you roll with, right? Because sometimes those I think can be sort of an illusion, because you're not starting over, right? You're just building, kind of carrying it over. This was sort of starting from scratch at West Virginia outside of his son, who ended up getting hurt anyway, and having success, which I thought made that all the more impressive. But you can get
to just talk about the turnaround in Morgantown. West Virginia won 9 games in 2024. They were 4-14 in Big 12 play. They went 19-13 in this year, so there was a 10-win improvement overall, 6-win improvement in the Big 12. You mentioned his son, who was MVC Player of the Year, I think twice, was an honorable mention All-American. His last season at Drake, started the season very well, and actually so did West Virginia. West Virginia was 11-2 on January 4th, and they beat Oklahoma State. They beat Gonzaga I saw them. They looked good in that game. They beat Gonzaga in Atlantis. They beat Arizona in Atlantis. They beat Kansas on the road. And I think that was right after Tucker DeVries got hurt. He's been out since December. He will be getting the year back. I don't think it is hard to do the math and to understand where he's going to wind up. He had a shoulder injury, but by all accounts, he's going to get the year back. He's going to be healthy for next season. That already kind of gives you a cornerstone piece, a player who averaged I'll pull this up real quick here. A player who averaged more than 21 points a game in his last year at Drake was averaging almost 15-5 across 8 games at West Virginia this year, including, I think, shooting 47% plus from behind the 3-point line before he got hurt. Over his last 2 years at Drake, 18.6 points, 5.7 rebounds, 1.8 assists, and then 21.6 points, 6.7 rebounds, and 3.7 assists per game. And I say that not just to talk about sort of spinning forward, though we will at a certain point with all this. I also say it to point out, he did what he did here in turning West Virginia around, even though he did not have his best players. So not even to, you mentioned that too, but even to your point, it's not even just sort of lifting up what he did at Drake and putting it down in West Virginia. It's also that he built this team around his son, who's an incredibly talented player. If he does come to Indiana, which everyone expects, I suspect we're talking about one of the 5 to 8 best players in Big Ten next season if he's healthy. But he also is able to do a lot of this without, they beat Kansas without Tucker DeVries. They beat Iowa State without Tucker DeVries. They beat, they came close. I think they came close to beating Baylor on the road and beating BYU at home, 2 NCAA tournament teams without him. And, it's funny that in the last podcast, we sort of waved away all the West Virginia, furor, and Indiana didn't really have a place in it. Now, suddenly I think some people in Bloomington are going to be maybe fighting that corner a little bit harder. But there is a legitimate argument that he really should have made the tournament this year. And also that this year looks more impressive by maybe the tune of 2 to 3 wins, at least if he has his son, if Tucker DeVries is healthy for most or all of this year. So the point I'm trying to make here is this is someone who he's been a head coach for 7 years. The jobs have not always been easy. If anything, they've probably been a little bit harder than is perceived. And he's won basically wherever he's been. And if you want to stretch that back to his time as an assistant coach, as you said, under multiple head coaches, that applies just as much. You don't want to give an assistant too much credit for, like an NCAA tournament appearance or something while they're on staff, but winning has followed Darian DeVries kind of wherever he's been, certainly since he matured into coaching.
Yeah, and I think another thing that's important to look at in terms of like spinning it forward is that, the recruiting class that they had coming in from high school was ranked 23 in the country, 3 4-stars. Obviously the top they landed the top player from West Virginia, also 2 players from California, 2 top 100 players. I mean, that's a good recruiting haul for a West Virginia team. In short time, that was kind of his first full recruiting class. Whether those guys join him or not, obviously we'll wait and see. But in terms of just like what he was able to do in such a short amount of time at West Virginia, win games, recruit some high school kids, obviously did well in the transfer portal. Those are the things you're going to need sort of here in the short amount of time at Indiana to get this going. So, I mean, those are things that I think bode well for him with this job. I mean, there's some frustration in the comments I was kind of looking at just in terms of like, he's not the name that some of these people, like Bruce Pearl, Nate Oates, but I'm not sure those were ever coaches on the radar here. I don't know. I mean, what is your kind of interpretation of like the idea of a name?
Well, like
we talked about that before in terms of like, this is kind of more of a job where I think you build the name as opposed to just sort of,
and also remember, I mean, like Nate Oates' buyout is $18 million, and that's before taxes. So, like, I mean, there are coaches here that just weren't, like some people brought up Nate Oates. Mick Cronin's name was bounced around a lot, and I'm not even necessarily sure Mick Cronin's a better hire than Darian DeVries, but one or the other. His buyout was, I think, $16 million before taxes. It would have fallen to 10 on April 1st, but that's still before taxes. So we're still talking about numbers that I understand that, like, sometimes money in college athletics seems like funny money, but especially with revenue sharing, it isn't, and certainly not anymore. Again, if I'm not mistaken, the largest buyout anyone's ever paid for a head coach was Mark Pope going from BYU to Kentucky last year for about $6 million, all in. And there's some complicating factors here, some taxes that I think are going to factor in. And then I think, I'm not positive about this, but I think Indiana may be on the hook for a small remainder of what West Virginia owed in buyout plus gross taxes to Drake when Drake bought DeVries out of his contract last year. All in, I think Indiana's going to settle around $6 million as well on this. That's a record number. Like that, it's the idea that you can triple that, especially in the rev share era, just isn't practical. As you said, the goal is to go hire the coach and grow the coach in the job. And it's also like, this is not a winning the press conference thing. I don't believe in winning the press conference. I do think in the modern era, you've got to have a plan to win quickly. Like the days of, I'm going to come in and, give me a couple years to recruit and develop my roster, and that's when we'll really turn it on. Maybe in the meantime, we'll fight for the NIT or we'll be on the bubble, but we'll really turn it on. You look around college basketball this season at how many teams turn their fortunes around very, very quickly. You're thinking about, certainly some hires like Kentucky or Louisville, thinking about some guys that maybe had just are still betting in, like Grant McCaslin, who was good last year at Texas Tech and then clearly went up another level this season. The point is, especially somewhere like Indiana, I think Pete Nikos from On3 reported West Virginia's NIL number was understood to be around 3 million. Indiana's is north of 5. I think all in, it might be approaching 6 in NIL. Now that you've got this person in the door, you got your head coach in the door well in advance of the house settlement deadline, you're going to be able to take complete and full advantage of the portal, and in all likelihood have, if not all of your roster, then certainly the meat and bones of your roster in place before April 7th. I think we're talking about a world where next year's roster is constructed on 8 figures worth of NIL plus rev share easy. There is going to be an expectation that this has got to come together. Not that Indiana's got to go to the Final Four next year, but simply that the blueprint as laid over the challenge at Indiana shows clear return on investment starting next season. You talk about Dr. DeVries. I think there are some other players that Indiana, Amani Hansberry is only a sophomore. Jonathan Powell was a freshman. Sincere Harris was a sophomore. There's some other players that played meaningful minutes for West Virginia last season that you wouldn't be shocked to see join Indiana as well. Mike has disappeared from the podcast. I'm not sure what's going on, so I'll vamp for a little bit here. His internet hates Mind Your Banners. The point is there kind of is a need to win quickly, as much as humanly possible. And again, maybe not necessarily win a Big Ten title, go to a Final Four, but certainly even if you want to look around the Big Ten and you think about some recent examples, Dusty May at Michigan would be a good one, I think. Kevin Willard only needing a couple of years to properly turn it on at Maryland. Whereas in the same breath, you feel like whatever's kind of happened at Ohio State has kind of stalled out because of the way Chris Holtman's tenure ended, and then Jake Diebler not being able to pick it up and run with it. Mike's browser crashed. He's trying to pull back in here, so you can tell I'm very much in vamp mode at the moment. There is an established pattern in Darian DeVries' history as a coach of being able to win quickly. Now, I think there's probably some questions that we've seen some in the chat of who's going to stick around. I think it's fair to point out again that April 7th deadline and the fact that Indiana now having a head coach means that these conversations can begin immediately with what players might still have some eligibility remaining, and Indiana also being able to operate with that full NIL plus rev share number means that Indiana can have some very sort of frank conversations about, compensation at a level that it probably wasn't even able to a year ago. But you would imagine there's going to be some turnover. Of course, we've already seen Gabe Cupps go in the portal on Tuesday. I would be surprised if he's the last, let's say, current Hoosier, quote unquote, to go into the portal. I would also be, surprised if he's the last one to do what Cupps did in his sort of official statement, where he said, "I'm in the portal. I will still be monitoring what's going on in Indiana," which you take to understand is sort of he'd like to have that conversation with whoever the next head coach is. But as I said, and we'll turn to some comments here if Mike's not back in the chat because he's in the stream because he's still trying to load back up. It's not a hire that comes without some questions. One of the things that I think is Fred Haviland asked there, are Tom Ostrom and Chester Frazier coming? So I don't know on Ostrom. Obviously, he was at Indiana for the breadth of Archie Miller's tenure. He's been with DeVries for, I think, the last 3 years. He was with him for at least 1 year, I think 2 years at Drake, and then he went with him to West Virginia. I've seen some speculation that Frazier actually might be in the frame for the head job at West Virginia. I know he would be, at very least, a somewhat interesting appointment at Indiana. Frazier, for those who may not know, played at Illinois. He was famous in part for the chest bump with Eric Gordon in the IU-Illinois game in 2008. I think he's also had some things to say about Indiana on social media. Since then, he was with Brad Underwood for a number of years at Illinois. He just moved to West Virginia to be associate head coach and has a really, really good reputation as a recruiter. So if West Virginia does not want to bring him, or excuse me, if West Virginia does not want to elevate him as head coach, I could see a world where he is he's an appealing option for Darian DeVries, if not one that maybe would have to change, I don't know, some Twitter posts or something at some point down the line. But you know what? College sports are fun for that reason. The other person I would mention in staffing, and again, this is all very early. I mean, we are kind of digging into this like very, very quickly. But the other person I would mention is Corey Barnett, who was, of course, on roster at Indiana for the first 4 years of Tom Crean's tenure. He had been with Steve Alford for a number of years, both at Nevada and at UCLA before then. And Corey Barnett was hired onto West Virginia staff when DeVries came over from Drake. Last year, he actually ran into Corey and caught up with him in the Bahamas back in November. I would not be shocked if Corey Barnett winds up on this staff in some capacity as well. So the point is, I think that I would imagine there is going to be some carryover. I would be surprised if there's not from the staff. But there are always going to be elements to that in terms of you don't know what other opportunities guys might have if, again, for example, West Virginia wants to explore elevating Chester Frazier to full-time head coach, then you would understand why Chester Frazier is not going to want to be an assistant at Indiana. Mike, you're back. That was a lot of vamping. I just talked for a long, long time.
It's your wheelhouse. Big picture.
What was your journey while you were gone?
I was worried that your computer has spread your failures. Your computer failures have spread.
I don't think that's how that works.
Maybe through the Zoom or StreamYard, through the StreamYard. So what were you saying?
No, I took a question from the
cassettes. These are books. What is it? Books on this side. This side, books, Genesis games and Sega games, and then Nintendo and miscellaneous, Fred, not cassettes.
Right.
Lots and lots of video games.
No, Fred asked, and a number of people had about, there are a few IU ties on West Virginia staff. Would some of those coaches come over? And I said I'd be surprised if at least one or two didn't. But, there are kind of layers to that I don't think we can parse out, immediately tonight. I think let's acknowledge the other side of it, which is, there are elements to Darian DeVries' profile that, quite frankly, aren't as compelling. Number one of the big ones that jumps out to me is this year's the first year in 7 years as a head coach that he's had a top 20 adjusted offense or defense efficiency wise. His teams don't tend to play very fast, although his Drake teams played faster historically than his West Virginia team. I mean, that obviously that's just kind of one season at West Virginia. Generally speaking, his teams tend to shoot the ball pretty well, but they're kind of hit or miss in overall adjusted offensive efficiency. If you do dig back through his Drake years, I think it was either the last 4 years or the last 5 years at Drake. His teams finished in conference play alone in the top 4 in the Missouri Valley in both adjusted offensive and defensive efficiency. So relative to the competitive level, his teams have been pretty successful. But it's not like you look at one thing he does and say, that's revolutionary, or one thing he does and say his teams are just consistently absolutely elite at that. If there is anything like that in his profile, it's how rarely his Drake teams turn the ball over and how well they rebounded the ball defensively. But it's in addition to the fact that he's got one NCAA tournament win in the first 4 game during the COVID tournament, and that's it. I look at his statistical profile and I say, I'm going to need convincing a little bit here that, there's a level that he can go up from a, sort of a performance perspective by the numbers anyway to deliver what Indiana expects.
Well, in terms of what? I mean, like just how they play? I mean, won't the talent sort of dictate that? I mean, if you win, what sort of does – I mean, I know the metrics matter somewhat, but I mean, if you're winning 25 games a year, if that's sort of like the level, the standard level, doesn't it matter less how you get there than it does if you're sort of on a bubble team where the metrics sort of come into play?
I have a question actually on this. Do you think he would be a more appealing candidate if he hadn't been at West Virginia this year? Like if Indiana had hired him last year, and this is removing Dusty May or whatever, but if Indiana had hired him last year on the back of 106 wins in 4 years, Averaging 26.5 wins a season. I think an MVC regular season and 2 tournament titles, 3 NCAA tournament appearances, and a win in there. Like, do you think that people would perceive it differently, or do you think there's anything about and I mean, there are people in the comments, frankly, saying, no, not really, and that's fine. That's your opinion. I have no problem with that. But I'm curious for yours, Mike. Do you think his shine would be a little brighter with some fans if he had not been at West Virginia this year?
I think the shine would have been brighter if you reversed his NCAA tournament record.
3-1 rather than 1-3.
Or 1 in one of the years instead of, just exits the first round.
I guess you can't be 2-1 in the NCAA tournament. It's just you win a game and they're like, all right, you're done. You don't need to.
But just the idea that they had a run in there, I don't know, because I think, to be honest, I'm with Keenan when he said even less, it would be less appealing. I don't think I think it's a good hire on its face, but some people don't. But because I just think when you see what he did with West Virginia is what he's going to need to do, and he's that's the framework, right? Like, he certainly came in. Maybe he will say, the magic word, the blueprint word that Curt Cignetti likes. But he did. He had a blueprint for West Virginia, and it worked. And I think when you see sort of the results with 8 transfers and then building out sort of the high school recruiting and having success immediately there with the top 25 class, I think that, it kind of jumps off the page. It makes you feel, I don't know, if I was in the position of hiring somebody at Scott Dolson's level, like at the Big 12, to say he went from, last to 6th place, 10-win turnaround. I think that gives you some confidence that, look, now we're going to even give him better infrastructure. Now he's going to even have more NIL money. Like, you could see the growth, right? Like, I mean, he had success with Drake, did West Virginia, and now he's going to have, the sort of everybody kind of rowing in the same direction, like Curt Cignetti likes to say here for the basketball program in Indiana. And I think you just feel like he's going to, if you're, hiring him, take it to another level here.
I think the other thing, and this I think is, I guess, tomorrow's news today, I suppose, or tonight's news earlier tonight, because there's no such thing as tomorrow's news. I assume this will post tonight, but I think what I'm going to wind up writing is.
That was really confusing. I don't know what you're saying. Even you're like tonight, tomorrow.
I'm bending the space-time continuum. Is basically, like, to your point about infrastructure, that there's a little bit of this that I think is also Scott Dolson betting on himself. And when I mean betting on himself, I don't mean like literally just Scott Dolson, but I mean betting on the idea, because this was frankly something that was probably sort of sold around Mike Woodson's hiring. And then I think as time went on, Woodson sort of rejected the idea that he needed that infrastructure. And I think he equated basically like employees to infrastructure and just wound up hiring a bunch of sort of assistants and building out his staff without really availing himself of the ways in which maybe streamlining certain things or, sort of polishing or eliminating certain details might make everyone better at the job. I think Scott Dolson, especially given his experience with Curt Cignetti, has a real degree of confidence in his ability to support a head coach, essentially. And in the sort of the modern context of, here's how we raise money for NIL, here's how we build the relationship with our collective, here's how we're going to make revenue sharing work, on a sort of a year-by-year program by program basis. It's not clear yet. This is going to be a question for tomorrow. It's not clear yet whether Indiana will consider, like a general manager type position of any sort, or whether that's something that maybe DeVries is comfortable with or whatever. But I do think there's an element here of, and I think this would have been true with almost any hire, because again, I've been on record for a while as saying I didn't necessarily expect Indiana to hire sort of like a name that you flash in lights immediately. That is just historically not how these jobs get filled most of the time. It is, I think, reflective of an athletics director who feels like he's got a good infrastructure around his program that can support a coach and allow a coach to come in and hit the ground running. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's what he's talked about a lot. I mean, that's kind of what the idea with football was, is that at some point that they realized that their support was lagging behind and that was hindering the coach, whoever the hire was. And so they've tried to be more proactive, I think, with basketball to avoid sort of the issues they had with football, where they had to get to sort of that point where they could compete with the rest of the Big Ten. They've been sort of the leaders throughout the time here with Indiana. And so I think that, I think Scott's talked a lot about being forward looking and sort of making plans. Look, I think one of the big things people, I know some people aren't happy with the hire and that, but I think you're not seeing the bigger, like Zach likes the big picture of what this athletic department has done to sort of get ready and sort of stay ahead of the curve of revenue sharing, NIL, and having these plans ready and taking advantage of, like, look, the team failed, not because they didn't have the resources to succeed. And so I think when you look at what Indiana's been able to throw at kids on the basketball team the last couple of years, that's all good for this new era. Because look, no one can say Mike Woodson wasn't set up for success, right? Financially.
No, yeah, no. I mean, financially, and not just like here's a raw amount of money, go spend it, but almost more kind of the idea of
like infrastructure was in place. Like they had everything.
You say you need this, I'll go get it for you. You say you need, an extra video coordinator, we'll make that happen. You say you need an infusion of another, I don't know, $1 million or whatever in NIL money will make that happen. I mean, literally that. I think the example is like right here a year ago, the conversation on this program was that clearly wasn't good enough, but instead of cutting and running, we're going to double down on the NIL. We're going to give Mike Woodson all of the sort of resources that he needs to go get a better, more consistent, more talented, deeper roster. And then if he can't do it, that'll be it. And guess what? That's where we are.
I think the example of it, and I hate, keep going back to football, but I mean, the Bryant Haynes situation was sort of like a perfect example of having everything in place and aligned, right? Like you give him a contract extension, then even bigger teams come calling and you rip up the first one and write a new one and give him more money to lock him in. That's a sign to a coach within the school that, look, the AD is going to fight for you and fight for what you need. Like Kurt Cignetti said, I want to keep Bryant Haynes, and they made it happen. And so I think that's like applicable for basketball. Like whatever Coach DeVries needs, he's going to get it within obviously reason. But I mean, like I just feel like they've done a lot of that work, and so I think that's a big part of this story. It's not just the hire in and of itself. You have to have the support around him to make everything work right now, just because of the way the rules are set up, because revenue sharing and NIL is so integral to the success of teams right now. Like if you just don't have a plan, and I think you're going to see, we've talked about it, the gap I think is going to get bigger, and you're going to see teams that fall behind, I think, very quickly, that don't have the sort of financial the infrastructure in place that IU has put together.
I think the last issue is kind of where things go from here. Again, I think it's been widely reported Tucker DeVries is planning to enter the portal. I don't think anyone needs to. I think we can all connect the dots on what's going to happen there. He's got 1 year left, or at least he should be able to get this year back. There's been speculation, though I have not seen anything, about other players from West Virginia who might wind up going in the portal as well. If you look at their again, acknowledging that like they were kind of two different teams, one with Tucker DeVries and one without him. Amani Hansberry averaged 9.8 and 6.5 last season. I think Javon Small was a senior, was he not? I think he was.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's one where, if you're, I mean, he only played 16 games in 2021-22. Or year there, maybe I'm wrong. One way or the other, the point is, in all likelihood, there may be at least a couple other. I would say in all likelihood, at least one person is going to be following Darian DeVries from West Virginia onto Indiana's roster. There may be some others. The next thing that I think happens probably in very short order is the conversations with Indiana's potential returning players, Luke Goody, Malik Renew, Miles Rice, Ja'Kai Newton. Gabe Cupps said I mentioned this, I think, while you were off air. I would be surprised even if others go in the portal. I would be surprised if necessarily there are not some, they don't take a similar approach where they say, I'm still going to kind of consider Indiana. I'm just going to the portal to consider my options. And then the other thing this does is it allows Indiana to get as much as it can set up before Monday when the portal window opens for everybody else. And that way, if you're Indiana, you can try and pull your roster together basically as fast as humanly possible.
Yeah, I think it allows you, he has the runway to see what players he wants to retain. And then on the 24th, he could just, he's ready to sort of have a plan in place to sort of what he needs to go grab. Absolutely.
Anything else? I mean, I'm not going to ask you like grade the hire or anything. I kind of see both sides on this. I don't know if that's been clear through this podcast. There on the one hand, again, you can get, and maybe we've seen Indiana burned on this in some recent hires, some hires in the recent past. You can kind of get obsessed with feeling like, we're going to go find like the hidden genius, essentially. And ignore just like guys that just do well. And listen, wherever he's been, he's won. He's either, because a lot of people credit Nico Medved for kind of setting the stage at Drake for what DeVries and then McCollum did. That basically it was kind of at the bottom. Medved did a good job, was only there 1 year and then left, but he did leave it better than he found it. And then DeVries took it up another level. Obviously, again, you can be underwhelmed by what he did at Virginia. It is immensely better than what Virginia did the year before and what is still a difficult conference and what was a difficult situation for him. Because I think the other part of this too is, again, if, for example, if Tucker DeVries doesn't get hurt, we're not having this conversation tonight because West Virginia is almost certainly in the NCAA tournament and nobody is available. DeVries is not available to go from West Virginia to Indiana this week because he's getting ready for the tournament game. And then again, it's what a good job did Darian DeVries do to take a 9-win West Virginia team and win 22 or 23 games and get into the NCAA tournament. But what I'm trying to say is that I see it both ways. He's never been in the Ken Pom top 50. There's no one part of his approach that I look at and say, that's incredible, that's elite. If that translates over to the Big Ten, this is just going to be like a house on fire right away. But it's also impossible to ignore the fact that wherever the dude is gone, he's won. And sometimes we can be guilty of overcomplicating things, especially when we talk about coaching hires. And sometimes it is as simple for example, with Mark Pope, there was a lot of, well, how's he going to handle, taking his system somewhere else, or how's he going to handle this? And it was just sort of like, maybe the solution is just his offenses shoot a lot of threes, make a lot of threes, and are incredibly efficient, and that wins games, and that's going to translate, and it did. Sometimes it is that simple.
Yeah, and I think we could. I don't know if you mentioned the press conference tomorrow at 11:30. He'll be reduced, so we could try to maybe regroup, do one together from the building tomorrow if we can find a space. Talk with fans after and give them our impressions of the introductory press conference. I think that'll be interesting to hear what Scott Dolson has to say, and see what DeVries himself has to say.
For the record, just Keenan, and I want to be clear. I'm just going to put this one comment up, Keenan. I think you have made some good points on some of your drawbacks on the hire. I don't know if I agree completely with all of them. I am only going to correct you on this one. Mark Pope had never won an NCAA tournament game before he got to Kentucky. He'd been to the NCAA tournament twice, and he was knocked out in the first round as a 6th seed both times. It was one of those where BYU, Ken Pom says they would have been a 5 seed according to his formulas had the 2020 tournament been played, and that might have been Pope's best BYU team. That 2020 BYU team, his first one, but Mark Pope had not won an NCAA tournament game before he got to Kentucky. And listen, if you don't want to give Darian DeVries too much credit for winning a first 4 game against Wichita State in a COVID tournament in Indianapolis, I totally understand that. I can give you like the best sort of Darian DeVries analysis I can offer you is that, quite frankly, I think they played Miami better in 2023 than Indiana did in the NCAA tournament. They lost that game by 7. They were actually leading that game for long stretches and then kind of faded down the stretch. And that was, of course, a Miami team that wound up turning around and going all the way to the Final Four. Miami held Tucker DeVries to 1 of 11 from behind 3-point line in that game, and that was a big part of the reason why. Miami won that game. The point is that Drake team was actually probably closer to beating Miami in that tournament than Indiana was. So that's the best I can give you. I'll throw this out in the last one. Sorry if I missed this, but does this clearly open the door for Ben McCollum to Iowa? I imagine that is the name they turn to. I think Iowa's had a rough 24 hours in the news cycle because I think it is. It's been made abundantly clear that program does not have a ton of resources right now to commit to men's basketball. That's one of those places that has. I think a lot of people have wondered between the obvious cultural importance of football and then the existence of some really kind of culturally important sort of non-revenue sports like wrestling and women's basketball, whether men's basketball suffers a little bit there. It will not suffer in Indiana. Indiana, I think, is going to be looking at an NIL number certainly north of 5, maybe north of 6, at least, for everything that is done before the revenue sharing deadline, or the house settlement deadline. And then I think rev share is probably going to be at least about the same amount of money. We're going to be talking about, a roster that is probably substantially more expensive than the one that actually succeeds it, assuming the NIL clearinghouse holds up. So we'll leave it there for tonight. He's Mike Neislick. I'm Zach Osterman. Thank you all so much for watching, for listening. As Mike said, I don't know if we'll have time to do a live one tomorrow. We'll see. We'll see if we can find somewhere. Well, but we might.
Always making excuses. Unreal.
You dipped out of this podcast for 12 minutes while you were, I don't know, like replacing your hard drive in your computer.
It was.
I've done the heavy lifting here. Okay.
It was like 4 minutes. It was like 4 minutes.
You have the usage rate of like a 3-and-D shooter right now. I'm a star. Okay.
Hey, when your computer went down, who offered you a backup computer if we were going to Dayton?
Yeah, I didn't need it because IT fixed it. This is no. You don't get to take credit for things that ultimately never happen. Okay. This just take.
Stop surfing on the dark web, and maybe we won't have problems.
Take your role, take your lesser role, and accept it. I'm the point guard.
Wow.
You're the shooter. It's fun.
Wow. Harsh.
He's Mike Neislick. I'm Zach Osborne for the Herald Times, for the Indianapolis Star. We'll have a lot more tonight at heraldtimesonline.com and indystar.com/sports. We will have even more tomorrow at both places from Darian DeVries' hiring press conference. But for now, thank you all for watching, for listening. We'll talk to you soon.